Hello and welcome to MEthinks. I'm your host, Ali Simpson, and today we will be talking with Democratic State Senator Justin Chenette about ethics and politics. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ali.
Yeah, and just to tell our viewers a little bit about you, you served 2 terms in the House of Representatives before being elected to the Senate last year. You're a member of the Senate Committee on Conduct and Ethics, and you represent the towns of Hollis, Leamington, part of Buxton, Old Orchard Beach, Saco, Funtown, and Splashtown?
Correct, both. It's critically important.
Oh, that's good. All right. So just to, kind of getting to know you question, when you were elected to the House of Representatives, you were 21,
Correct.
And now you're 25. So you are pretty young. And I guess how did you get the people who elected you to take you seriously in a kind of an old state such as Maine? And then once you got the job, how did you get your colleagues to take you seriously?
I think people really wanted something different. I think Maine really values new and young leadership. And I think the fact that we haven't had a lot of young people step up to serve still creates an opportunity for young people to make a difference, to say, you know what, I want a seat at the table in crafting sound decision making. It's one of those things where if you're not at the table, you could be on the menu sort of thing. You need to be there crafting those solutions, and having a variety of opinions is critical. And I think when I went, door to door, I was a 20-year-old college student knocking on doors saying, vote for me. I'm a spiky-haired college student, but I really want to earn your vote. It really came down to a different approach, and I think that was critically important, that young people's voices were being heard as well. Student loan debt is a critical issue, jobs for young people. If we don't solve the issue of young people fleeing our state to go to other places for job opportunities, we're not going to have a young, vibrant workforce. We're not going to have a solid tax base to pay for the essential programs and services that all demographics utilize. So I think they recognize that. And in terms of serving in government, we have actually about 13 members of the legislature under the age of 30 on both sides of the aisle. Oftentimes we get together and we meet, and we actually have been able to pass significant reforms regarding education and a lot of other issues in a very bipartisan way, because I find that the millennial generation is less partisan than other generations, which I think yields to better results in government.
Yeah, they ask, what can you get done for us, and what is best for all of us?
Right.
That's wonderful. I do kind of want to get into it about a very serious issue.
Okay.
You co-sponsored a bill to allow wine tastings at farmers markets. Are you in the pocket of Big Farmers Market, also known in Maine as Big Pharma?
It is the most hotly contested issue this legislative session. And now, if we mean big farmers markets as the Maine Farm Bureau, then great. I love the farmers across our state, including in my own district. We have a lot of farms in my district in Leamington and in Hollis and in Saco. But no, you're right. It is kind of an interesting bill. It's actually a bill from one of my Senate colleagues, Senator Dave Miermont. And just so that everybody knows, we have over 2,000 bills that we're dealing with in about a 6-month period of time. Co-sponsoring bills, I like to attribute it like signing yearbooks. Sometimes it's strategic. Sometimes you might sign somebody's bill because you want to forge a working relationship with them. So for instance, I've co-sponsored several Republican bills, sometimes to the dismay of some of my Democratic colleagues, but I think it's important to have the conversation. We might still disagree on the topic or the issue, but at least have the debate. Let the facts go where they are. Have the public be able to come up and have a hearing on the topic. So I find that there's a lot of reasons why somebody might co-sponsor a bill.
Yeah. Just to let someone know that you want them to have a nice summer,
And who doesn't want wine tasting at farmers markets? I think it makes the experience all that much more pleasurable.
Now, I do have to ask, how many of these farm fresh vegetables would it take for you to sponsor a bill to allow wine tastings at public access television?
This is a little healthy for me. Where's the chocolate? No. This sounds like a metaphor for lobbying, I think, Ali. But
possibly. These are all yours. This is under $300, just to let you know.
Yes.
So am I lobbying you right now? If you were just to consider.
You're providing a sampling of locally produced goods.
All right. I didn't know if this was above board or not. I guess I want to know, what is the difference between someone educating a legislator or advocating for something and lobbying?
Well, I like to view lobbying in the sense of when you're paid to talk to a legislator, which you are not, Ali, I don't think. So when you're paid by a multinational corporation, when you're paid by a political action committee, when you are paid by any organization that's trying to influence public policy decision making, that is lobbying. Now, there's a form of lobbying where you have to register within the state. And so those are the individuals that basically line the halls in Augusta that talk to us every single day. And so when those individuals are dumping unlimited amounts of money into not only campaign committees of legislators, but also political action committees known as PACs, on the national level, super PACs, therein lies a difference between advocating and essentially completely legalized bribery. I think there's a major difference. If you came up to Augusta, Ali, and said, I want to advocate for healthier lunches for our students, that's a great conversation. You'll be provided 3 minutes to come up in front of a committee of jurisdiction and during a public hearing and testify in support or against a particular bill. That's great. That's our democratic process at work. But the idea of people flooding in with money to try to influence outcomes of policy decision making, that is a line that has been crossed that I think is different than simply a member of the public advocating for a particular passage of a bill.
And would you say, and when lobbyists, Maine compared to other states, a lot of our lobbying is somewhat transparent. When you say they have to register, they have to disclose the activities that they're doing, but do you think that transparency is just not enough, or?
I would say it's somewhat transparent.
Yeah.
I think sometimes these political action committees are set up and you have no idea on the surface who and what they represent. You might have a PAC to Making Maine Great Again PAC. Yeah. Well, who runs the Making Maine Great Again PAC? Who runs the Empowering Maine Leadership PAC? Who runs these sorts of groups? Yes, we have a Maine Ethics Commission where it's a publicly accessible website for people to look up that information. But honestly, can I ask you a question, Ali? Do you know how to look up the information on who runs a PAC if it's not in your name? Like if you had the Ali PAC with your last name, you could at least know that Ali runs the PAC, right? Yeah. But if your name is not attached to it, how do you know unless you dig for that information? So yes, there is publicly accessible information, but how you access it can be difficult.
Is it through a crummy state website, or do you have to do fill out a bunch of forms, send
you
them
can
in,
go on the website. You can go on the website, but again, it's a little onerous. It's a little difficult for folks to do that. So it's not like that we don't have transparency. Yes, people have to register, but I will say there is a loophole in the lobbying law where folks can lobby legislators as long as it's under 8 hours a month and not register. So there is a loophole in the existing law.
That is what I did want to get into that with Adam Good, who I feel like he's in hot water right now. He basically, once he was out of office, he started working for the AFL-CIO, and then kind of his part of his argument is that he's only doing under 8 hours a month of lobbying, I think, if that's what he's, and that's an issue that and he could immediately do that, correct? Like once he was out of office, he could just go and then he doesn't have to register with the state, or he doesn't have to be accountable for any of his activities. Is that?
So let me break down what the current law is. So right now, if you're a former lawmaker, so say you've ended your service either by choice because you don't want to run for re-election, or it's because you're termed out, right? Because we have term limits within the state. You, under current state law, have to wait an entire year, 365 days, in order to be able to be a registered lobbyist. Now, you're right. There is a loophole in the law where if it's under 8 hours, which, by the way, is hard to track, what do you constitute those 8 hours? Is it emailing legislators? Is it calling legislators? Who's tracking who you're calling after hours? You know, I think that's hard to track, which I think is why the Maine Ethics Commission most recently had a recommendation that we fix this loophole. We address this issue, which hopefully we'll be addressing very shortly. My problem, though, is with the entire system. It's not necessarily with one particular lawmaker or official. And I think that's important to recognize. This is not picking on one individual. Both parties do this. Both sides do this. And we play into this system because there's lack of accountability in the system. I want to shift towards at least saying 4 years you'd have to wait before a former lawmaker can become a lobbyist. That allows 2 terms, because we have each term in a legislative term is 2 years. So by waiting 4 years, 2 terms, you've allowed enough time, I think, to at least have at least a little bit better of a situation. Because keep in mind, Ali, the reason why lawmakers probably make good lobbyists is because they developed good relationships, right? They know all the players, they know all the department officials, but that also makes it scary because whatever corporate interest they're representing, whatever organization they're representing, they have a leg up on everybody else. And guess who loses in that scenario? Maine people, the public. So I think we need to strengthen our ethics laws.
And when you say that, like a lot of noise is made about that. Not that I'm saying you're making a lot of noise, but a lot of, like, when it comes down to it, it is a very bipartisan issue that people get very riled about. It's like, oh, money in politics. We have to cut down on lobbying and do this and do that. And ultimately, a lot of meaningful change, when it comes down to it, doesn't happen. There might be, a little rule change here or there, but what happens is that for you guys to do that, it is actively going against your own interests in a way. There's been a lot of talk about the idea of a career politician. Like like this election season, like with Donald Trump, his whole spiel is like, I am not a career politician. I'm above being corrupt. Obviously not true. I'm above being corrupted because I have all this money. I'm at the top of the social dog pile. I don't need need to be beholden. Whereas the reason there's a revolving door is most people don't know that you guys get paid peanuts. Your salary is pretty low. It's not why you get into it, but it's a means to climb up this political hierarchy. So what does the phrase career politician mean to you, and do you intend to be a career politician?
Well, I think it's important to unpack all of that.
Yeah.
I think, number one, yes, we get paid about $11,000 a year.
Yeah.
One of the top lobbyists in the state make almost $300,000 a year. So if that doesn't tell you the power dynamics at the State House, I don't know what is. When the lobbyists get paid $300,000 and the legislators get paid $11,000. And I mention that not to be like, oh, well, poor legislators. We signed up for this.
Yeah.
This is public service. But at the same time, the people that end up having the most power are the special interest groups and lobbyists with the largest checkbook. They're the ones that are dictating what manufactured crisis we're dealing with next, not about the long-term systemic problems facing our state. So until we breach this issue, and you mentioned both sides play the game, that is why nothing ends up getting done, because guess what? The leadership on the Democratic side and the leadership on the Republican side, it's in their best interest to keep the status quo. Because why? Because they like the money coming into the coffers on both sides. We have to have mutual disarmament of the Democrats and the Republicans in the legislature, because frankly, I don't separate the difference between Democrats and Republicans when you have power. It's the power-hungry nature of the system that is the problem, because it's really about holding on to that power as long as you can. And guess what you need in order to hold on to that power? In terms of some people, I disagree with this philosophy, but money.
Yeah.
That's what it circles back to. But to answer your question about career politician, I have to work 3 different jobs to pay my rent.
Yeah.
So this idea, I mean, just to be honest.
Yeah.
So I don't view myself as a career politician. I ran for office when I was 20 years old and in college, and I was called a career politician then. I'd never run for public office before, and I had asked my opponent, how am I a career politician when I'm still going to college, I'm still figuring things out, but I want to make a difference. And I think we need to restore a sense of trust and credibility back into the institution of government in order for public service to mean something in this state and in this country, so that it's not a bad thing to actually run for office and serve your community.
Yeah, and that's the ideal scenario, is to, when you think about that, is it should be a public service, but it also means, because the salary is so low, you're either getting into it because in the purest form you want to serve your community, of course, or you're independently wealthy and it's a means to a better career, or you are you are a climber, you want to get to a higher position of power, you want to play that game. So there's the system rewards. Basically, the person who's getting the worst deal out of all this is the person who's going into it for the public service aspect. So basically, how it is set up is the people who are getting the worst deal are the people who have the best intentions. It's sort of like whoever runs for president is probably not someone you want to be president, if that makes sense. So it's
we get a bad group of folks. Sometimes we get folks that have differing interests. I think that's noted. But we also lose sight of a diversity of individuals that want to run for the legislature. If you are lower income, it's really hard for folks to run for office. If you're a young person just starting out, it's almost impossible, which is why out of so many legislators, we only have about 13 that are under the age of 30. It's because it's quite I mean, I find it excruciatingly difficult sometimes. My husband and I sort of have these conversations repeatedly, and he's like, Justin, you could work and actually make some money where we can actually own a house and we can actually, achieve some milestones in our life beyond just trying to scrape to get by. And it's because this idea of service above self that we tend to profess in our Rotary Club so often is, sometimes you have to believe in that ideal of going beyond yourself and something bigger than yourself. I can't tell you how many times that I've been told, oh, Justin, if you really want a successful political career up in Augusta, you need to stop talking about strengthening ethics, you need to stop talking about PAC reform, you need to stop talking about fixing, money in politics, because ultimately, guess who gets rewarded the key committee assignments? Guess who gets the chairmanships of committees?
Yeah, you're not doing yourself any favors. You're going to be ultimately possibly marginalized in your, based on what you're advocating.
So you'll never see me in a leadership role in Augusta, and you will never see me probably chair or be on a committee that I actually asked for, because I believe in this issue so strongly, because I believe somebody has to say what needs to be said in order to raise awareness for this issue that oftentimes is not talked about, because guess what? It's on the evening news. It's that, the wine tasting bill. It's the hedgehog bill. It's the making the state dog the Labrador Retriever. It's the state dessert, the whoopie pie.
So
and yes, great, yes, we have to point out ludicrous bills and ludicrous laws, but the real legislation, the important conversations that we need to be having are not being had because, and again, as a former, I went to school for broadcast journalism. It's one of those things, I understand the quick and easy soundbite, I understand the quick and easy story, but we have to get real about the problems that's facing our state, and we're never going to do that if we're starting to talk about hedgehog licenses, okay?
And so, I guess to get into some of those issues, because we were talking a little bit before the interview about how a lot of times these issues don't get as much coverage as they should, because a lot of people need more background information than to be like, hedgehog bill, how cute or how ridiculous,
Right.
And to have that immediate reaction to it. So I kind of wanted to talk about, because you were talking about earlier how it's difficult for someone who is poor or young to run for office, and I kind of wanted to discuss that in the context of the being a clean election candidate versus not being one. So can you describe what are the qualifications one needs to be a clean election candidate versus someone who doesn't?
So I've been both a traditionally financed candidate and a clean elections candidate, and I really appreciate having been through both experiences so I can understand the pitfalls and what we need to fix.
And were you a clean election candidate for the House or the Senate?
For both.
For both, okay.
So I was so basically my first run for office, I was traditionally financed and was like, my goodness, fundraising is difficult. And then I became clean elections because, again, I'm not independently wealthy, and fundraising, consumes a lot of your time. And one of the benefits of the clean election system is you're focused on the issues. You know, you're not focused on having, you know, swanky fundraisers with these awesome hors d'oeuvres, right, that we have on the table right now. We're focused on actually having meaningful conversations with voters. So with clean elections, it's a publicly financed system, and we're lucky to have that within our state, where you raise X number of what's called $5 checks. So you still have to get contributions, but you get, for instance, in the Senate, you have to get a couple hundred of these $5, they call them $5 checks, and they're $5 from individuals only within your district, and they're called qualifying contributions. So when you get to a certain threshold, you're able to qualify for public financing in order to fund your campaign fully. So, and that's really a good basis to start from. You know, I think in the Senate, if you are a qualifying candidate, you get like $20,000 in the general election. And again, if you're running against a traditionally financed candidate, they can still outspend you, which is one of the issues. Yeah.
So it keeps it local, keeps it with small contributions from your community.
Which is
but
great.
And then overall, though, it doesn't. It can't make up for like bigger races like the governor's race. You can't really run that on clean election money.
Well,
I mean, I guess you could, but you'd be vastly outspent. Or if you're running, you know, at a federal level for Senate or something.
I think you can, and I think one of the issues is I think there's a misconception about that, because we're right now debating whether or not to fund clean elections for gubernatorial candidates, and I think it's important. You know, $1 million plus I think is enough money. If you have a solid message, if you work hard, if you do the things that you need to do, you shouldn't need that. And quite frankly, there's so much money coming in from outside groups in both political parties that really it's not really about the candidate's campaign. It's ultimately things that they can't control, because there's no coordination, or there shouldn't be coordination between a candidate and outside groups.
Well, and when you say that's even the case within the state of Maine of a candidate, so a clean elections candidate can't work with their PACs. You know, they have PAC, like they can't have any role in that. But at the same time, Democratic Party or the Republican Party has PAC. Like PACs can spend money to help this candidate however they want, and the candidate has no control over that. So even if they they go by the books and they are a clean elections candidate, there's still money from sources where we don't know where it's coming from, just pouring in and influencing. Right. So really you have the appearance of, I guess, propriety, the appearance, and then also just in the intent, but at the same time, is it really effective?
Right.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, too, legislators can still run political action committees while they're running as a candidate.
Yeah, but not a clean elections. Right?
Well, we closed that loophole last session.
Okay.
So one of my bills that ended up passing, and I worked with Republican Wayne Perry in order to pass this, is close the loophole in the clean election system that did allow clean election candidates to run PACs on the side. Because what was happening is you had this double standard. You had people saying, I'm a clean election candidate, I'm not taking lobbyists and special interest money, and then on the side, they're taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from those very special interest groups and corporations. Now, the difference is when a legislator cannot spend their own PAC money on their own race. They spend it on other people's races. But what I always say is the big issue is it's not what you spend the money on, it's who is donating to your PAC. Because if you're a legislator, and say you sit on the Energy and Technology Utilities Committee, the committee that oversees regulations regarding the telecommunications industry. So Time Warner Cable, Verizon Wireless. So these companies always come to the legislature wanting different relaxation of different laws and regulations. Now, if you sit on the committee, do you think it's okay for the legislator to then accept contributions to their particular PAC from Time Warner Cable, Verizon, and the telecommunications industry when they, on the committee, are supposed to be overseeing the regulations over that industry? That is the reoccurring problem. It's not necessarily the fact that they're spending or not spending that money on their own race. It's the fact that they're being influenced by the same corporations we're supposed to be regulating. It is a rampant issue at the State House, and it's something that goes unnoticed.
And it kind of goes in reverse of that. Is just, as you were talking, you reminded me of kind of the controversy with Ryan Tipping, who was working for. This was for a little bit different. He was paid $9,000 by a PAC to work on the 3% surcharge, and I think it was all kind of above board. But it was also, I think he was on the taxation committee also. So it's like the issues he cares about and the issues that are important to him. But he's also taking additional money from this outside source to push this issue. So it's a little different than you know, being paid, being influenced but it's also being paid to be an influencer outside of your traditional role, I guess, if that makes sense.
Well,
so you kind of have...
Yeah, I mean, he's my House chair of the Taxation Committee. I sit on as the Senate lead Democrat on the committee. I will say this, and you'll have to ask Representative Tipping about his own situation, but I will say, if we're going to fixate on one particular legislator, we're missing the big picture. And this is what my big problem is consistently, because trust me, I could go down the list of just about every legislator has
it's
something.
Systematic is the overall point.
But keep in mind, too, in terms of what you do for your private sector job, does that mean teachers can't vote on education issues? Because we've had former educators that are legislators. We've had former doctors. Actually, we've had current doctors. Does that mean they can't vote on healthcare issues?
It does raise the question, though, of, say, like, many legislators have their, different day jobs, and it's sort of the potential for interest to cross there as well.
Then make it a full-time legislature, because the reality is we have to have other jobs, or we can't pay rent, we can't live our lives. And so, yes, there's, I like the idea of having a part-time legislature because you get everyday folks, but at the same time, it's hard to get everyday folks, because in order to make ends meet, you really have to either live close to Augusta, or you have to have your own law practice. So you get a lot of lawyers, you get a lot of retirees, and you don't get a lot of young people that really do want to make a difference. But no, I will say, in terms of the PAC issue, I have a bill before the legislature now to ban legislators from operating PACs, whether you're clean, we dealt with last session, but now we need to do it for all legislators, because again, it doesn't matter whether you're clean or traditionally financed. You shouldn't be taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from special interest groups, because again, if we're going to get caught up in Representative Tipping's situation of $9,000 for a day job, and we're not going to focus on legislative leadership, hundreds of thousands of dollars from AstraZeneca and big pharmaceutical companies, we are missing the big picture, and we need to fix that.
And going back to the big picture and going back to outside money, which is probably a much bigger problem at this point, and it's something that's only getting worse, really, with super PACs and all of that. And what can you really do at the state level to, I don't know, either stop that or bring in some accountability of this?
Right. Yeah. Obviously, the ultimate objective is to overturn the horrible Citizens United decision at the Supreme Court level. But seeing that we're not going to have that anytime soon, given our current president, I think what we're going to end up with is we have to make sensible reforms at the state level regarding campaign finance reform. Now, some will say, you can only do so much because it'll be deemed unconstitutional. And my belief is I work hand in hand with the Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. Andy Bossie is a great executive director. Work hand in hand with that organization. And basically what we've derived at is other states have done basically a blueprint for where we need to go. For instance, South Carolina has a great law regarding banning lobbyist contributions for legislators. Because it's deemed as a targeted strengthening ethics approach, it's not necessarily deemed unconstitutional like you're banning free speech. Because guess what? That lobbyist can still donate to the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Green Party. That individual can still donate to individual PACs. But we're saying in order to strengthen the integrity of the legislature, we want to ban all lobbyist contributions just to sitting lawmakers. And I think that when you take that targeted approach, we win in the courts and we win in terms of sensible, sound public policy.
Yeah, and that makes sense in terms of a free much like putting small restrictions on free speech. There should be restrictions on what like speech, money and speech. Like there should be those provisions in place.
Right.
That makes sense. I did want to ask about. I wanted to ask about another way of holding politicians accountable that I think you're working on is the bill to recall politicians. If you just want to talk a little bit about that and about how that would work. I was reading a little bit about how it kind of cuts off the common criticisms of you can't do it in the first 6 months of office or the last 6 months of office. And under what circumstances would a state, or like the state of Maine, recall a politician? Would it be something? Are they offenses that kind of fall in like the impeachable kind of thing, or could it just be we don't like this guy, let's get him out of here?
I don't want to recall anybody. I don't want to end up in a situation like Wisconsin where you have to recall somebody every 5 seconds. That is not the objective. The objective is to give the public the power, give the public an extra tool of governmental accountability and transparency. And what this would basically do is we would have a high bar in order to meet in terms of the standards for even starting the process of recalling somebody. So basically how I said I crafted the bill, I basically analyzed states from all across the country and kind of took bits and pieces of what worked, what didn't work. So right now, in order to put a referendum on the ballot, you have to have 10% of the previous votes of the gubernatorial election. I go to 15% for recalling a politician. But before you even start the petition process, you have to get basically a recall sort of situation handled with the Maine Ethics Commission. So they would analyze the reasonings why you want to move towards recalling a politician. So you have a set of barometers. Did they do criminal conduct? Did they misappropriate public funds in an inappropriate way? Did they abuse their position of power? Did they not issue publicly voted on bonds? Did they do a number of things that you and I would see is egregious and something that needs investigation and needs further reflection? People don't have to sign the petition, right? But it gives them an option if something happens that was so horrible. Like I can probably give you a laundry list of Governor Paul LePage's actions within office that probably would deem a recall necessary, and I would even go further to say potential impeachment, or at least the investigation of impeachment, which I voted for happily. I think it's important to have just another tool, because sometimes you can't wait 4 years before someone's term is up, because you know what? They represent, in some cases, the entire state of Maine. And for us to be the laughingstock of the country when it comes to certain things because of the person that we put in power, I think we owe it to ourselves to give ourselves a tool to say, you know what? This is not okay. We're not going to wait around to the next election. You need to go right now. You know, the legislature has a tool called impeachment, but the public has no tool of accountability. I think we need to give them the power to make that happen.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to, I do want to kind of use that to transition into what can the public do to make our state more democratic and operate in a more ethical way, because I would say one of the advantages of having something like lobbyists is that you have these driven people who are educated, they're connected, they have a one-on-one, kind of like this basically, right. but a one-on-one access to people who can make the big decisions. And for a lot of people aren't educated, they're not connected, they don't really have much opportunity to really have a voice. And like an example I want to throw out there is, it's kind of just been big for a while, is the Riverview Psychiatric Center. That's one of those things that a lot of noise is made about it. You know, it's overcrowded, the workers are underpaid. It's, I think there was a bill to raise the pay on that and that kind of thing. And just very little has been done about it. And that's something, it's like, well, where's the money for people to advocate for the mentally ill, if that makes sense? You know, where's the, will the process work for things like that, I guess, for people who want to make a change outside of how all the changes get done, which is through money and through that kind of influence.
Well, I will say, we're supposed to be the people's lobbyists, and I think that is really important to note, because, yes, the average person, myself included, would not have the money to hire their own lobbyists to stand in the halls every day and schmooze legislators. But frankly, what gives me hope at the end of the day are the hundreds of emails I get directly from constituents about a whole broad range of issues. I know you listed some typical issues with the public and citizen engagement, but I have to tell you, having done this almost 5 years now, I am totally impressed with how engaged Maine people are in our politics. And maybe I can't speak for the entire state, I can only speak for my district, but I will say I end up spending countless hours a day communicating either on the phone or via email through my constituents, or on Facebook or on Twitter or now Instagram, not on Snapchat, but there's a limit. But I'm totally impressed. I mean, I have people in the ruralest part of my district, in a rural part of Leamington and Hollis, emailing me about very substantive pieces of legislation that they care about. that gives me hope at the end of the day that we can fight for their interests, and that legislators don't have to listen to lobbyists. They really don't, because the only people at the end of the day we need to listen to are the people that put us in these seats, and that's really important to remember.
But isn't there a challenge between the votes matter, sure, but also the means to be reelected matters? I think there's these two conflicts at this point that pull at someone who's maybe got into it doing the right thing, but you want to keep your job. You want to continue to maybe climb up to a more influential position, and if you have the means to do that, one lobbyist or a large political contribution is often worth, 20 emails or more than that. It's often worth a whole town of people wanting this and you doing the opposite. But
I don't necessarily see it that way. I mean, the NRA, for instance, camps out at the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee. I served on the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee for the past 2 years, and I don't take harassment and bullying from anybody, including high-paid, slick lobbyists sent up from Virginia from the NRA. And I say that for any of these groups that try to bully legislators. I mean, the fact that I'll have a private conversation with, say, a member on the opposite party as me, and they say, Justin, this bill is horrible. And then the next day, they've been pulled off to the side by one of these high-paid lobbyists to say, if you don't vote for this, we're going to bankroll your opponent. We're going to primary you in the next election cycle. We are going to send mailers and attack you. And then they're bullied into voting a certain way, even though they've told me, Justin, this is a horrible piece of legislation. And I say, why do you cave into these groups? Trust me, I've had so many pieces of mail that were against me. There's attack after attack. People have attacked me for who I love. People have brought my family into it. I've been through the ringer and back. And what gives me hope at the end of the day is the fact that there's an outpouring of support in the community. Those 20 emails from constituents is a heck of a lot more than any donation, because guess what? I don't accept donations. I do not run a political action committee, and I'm a clean election candidate. What contributions do I need? And I'm not beholden to anybody. I'm beholden to my district. That is what we need to return to. That is called public service, and that is what we need to have all elected officials remember at the end of the day.
How do you combat because much like, say, for example, the NRA coming down on you, doing the mailers, changing your own constituents' perception of you and your character or what have you. And so how do you, as someone, say, with limited funds, or you're just one person,
right,
how do you change the narrative, and how do you
You got to be in the district every day.
Yeah.
You know, anytime I get a chance to be back home in the Saco area, I am, you know, and I'm not just there attending things, I'm volunteering in the community. I'm very accessible. I think social media has really helped to negate some of the money in politics in a way, in terms of the local races, because guess what? You know, the nearly 5,000 people that I have on my Facebook page that are constituents, I can talk directly to them, not having to worry about a 30-second soundbite, not having to worry about the media, not having to worry about my opponent or the political parties. I can talk directly to them. I write a weekly column in the local paper. You know, there's so many things that you can do that go beyond money. You know, I hardly spend my, money in terms of direct communications with constituents, because I think the tools are at our disposal. You know, people still read the newspaper in Maine. We're about 5 to 10 years away from that big transition that you see in other parts of the country.
We are behind on that, and relying on that for long it's kind of much like we saw with this election, this national election.
Right.
The influence of social media in terms of destroying
it's good and bad,
and that's only a matter of time before that comes to Maine. It's only a matter of time before it's hyper focused, and
of course,
that's a whole separate issue of how you combat that message in terms of the war of communication and all of that. One other thing I wanted to get to, just on the topic of how we can more democratically change things, of course, the referendums that kind of come through. And I wanted to talk about one specifically about the minimum wage increase, which I thought was pretty fantastic. I think you were a co-sponsor on a bill that I wanted to talk a little bit about the training wage.
Yes.
Which is, for viewers, it is for those under the age of 20. and of course, correct me at any point, for those under the age of 20, they could not be paid more than $1 above whatever the federal minimum wage is. So like $8.25.
So that was the Republican, proposal.
Yeah.
I think, one of the things that I thought was really important. I support a minimum wage. I've introduced minimum wage legislation repeatedly in the legislature. In fact, I've made it a centerpiece of my campaign every single session. People need to be able to afford the gas in their car to get to the job. And I think if we had businesses and especially multinational corporations actually base wages on inflation, we wouldn't have to arbitrarily increase the minimum wage, because guess what? As the cost of goods and services, as the cost of the gallon of milk goes up, your wages go up. And then there needs to be no government intervention. But because corporate greed and CEO salaries, because wages have not kept up with productivity that has increased steadily over the last 30 years, and wages have not kept up with the cost of goods and services, we have to act. And I'm glad that the public said, hey, I'm not going to wait around for the legislature to have inaction. I'm going to act myself. And that's why I really believe in the referendum process. Now, get to the training wage piece. In my conversations with seasonal-based businesses in Old Orchard Beach, for instance, you mentioned Funtown earlier. So Funtown is one of the ones that employ a lot of high school students. I want to zero in on the high school student conversation. When I'm told by businesses in my district that they want an opportunity to come up to the State House and say, I'm not going to hire high school students anymore, or we're going to reduce the high school student staff to adults because they're not going to pay them $12 an hour, that's a concern. Giving them an opportunity to have a public hearing, I think, is important. Now, the reason I co-sponsored those bills, Ali, is very simple. I want to make sure that we have mandatory internship pay. Because guess what I did in high school? I did all these internships, and luckily I was in a position, and I'm sure you
intern life,
you did the internship life, but you know what? Low-income students can't necessarily do an internship, because guess what? They have to save for things like college and a car.
That's overall a separate issue, but at the same time, those under the age of 20 are trying to pay their way through college. 18
but
and
I wanted that
19-year-olds.
as part of the, so the reason and again, this gets back to why you co-sponsor bills. As part of the conversation, I told the sponsor of the bill, in order for me to vote for this at the end of the day, mandatory internships have to be included. Guess what? They're not. And so I'm not going to support this. But to be at the table in making sure that we have a progressive policy, because guess what happens, Ali? We have a Republican Senate and a Democratic House and a Republican in the Blaine House. That means they can pretty much get through a lot of things that are not necessarily things I believe in. So if we are going to sit down and compromise, I want to make sure that we have the most progressive bill possible. If that means we're able to get mandatory internship pay so that low-income students can actually achieve career success because they don't have to choose between saving for college or buying a car and going down a career path, that's really important.
So in this case, you would... I feel like you're saying you're trying to strike a balance between, because the reality is it does kind of undercut what the voters wanted with the referendum overall. It's like they want the $9 minimum wage raised up to 12. It's not 12 yet. It's going to be 12 in 2020. They want that. And then, of course, Republicans mostly introduced this to both undercut, I think, the value of all workers and the value of the voice of the voters themselves who wanted this.
There was a lot of bad bills, yeah.
Yeah, and of course you can say that practically that you want the seat at the table to do this, because realistically they could pass it without the internship thing that you're.
They just need a handful of votes in the House, and they could pass really bad pieces of legislation. And that's the scary part that we have to remember. In these political environments, we have to realize it's not as simple as black and white, who supports what or who doesn't support something. It's about crafting a negotiation. Now, as I said to the sponsor, I'm not going to support that bill if I don't see a couple things. I don't see mandatory internship pay in, which is not. I don't see a focus on high school students, 15, 16, and 17. We're not including college students. It was, the focus was to give Funtown, Splashtown a conversation starter at Augusta, and they did that. So again, as somebody who believed in the minimum wage, to make sure that people that are trying to pay their rent, that have a kid, or they're trying to save for retirement, that they have an opportunity to live a happy and successful life, I was there on the front lines advocating for that. But I think it's also important to also listen to our business community when they're saying, we want to lay off high school students, because those are my friends that they're laying off. You know, it was not too long ago that I was in high school. You know, I'm only 25 years old.
Yeah.
So the idea that, you know, there's going to be less students working at Ocean Park Sub Grocery, which is right down the street, is a concern. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. I want the facts to come out. I want to have that public debate so that at Augusta, we can be saying, you know what? The facts don't lead to that conclusion. The facts lead to that they need to be
ultimately,
paid.
if listening to business leaders, of course, is important, but if they, do you think you might be buying into a disingenuous argument that, oh, well, I'll lay off these teens to, you know, hire more experienced workers, which is not necessarily bad. Like, it does, you know, if you're 16, it sucks to get laid off, but it's also, it creates this, in an already very tough economy, especially like Maine, especially where young people are leaving in droves, creating something that is, I think, undercutting the value of older workers as well, because they're competing with teenagers who can now work for a lower wage, if that makes sense. So I think that it's listening more to people who are influential in the community versus, you know, teens who can't even vote. And
well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I have a lot of students that intern with me. I have a lot of students that volunteer on my campaigns. I'm in the schools almost every day. You know, I'm speaking to them, I'm reading to them. So this idea that somehow I'm not listening to students is not factually accurate. I think what is important to recognize is when I have constituents from all stripes, I don't just represent Democrats, I represent everybody as a legislator. I think that's important. We're not in campaign season. This is real life. This is government. And I think that's an important distinction. So when I hear from small businesses, I'm not talking about multinational corporations. Don't even get me started on multinational corporations. But I think when when a local constituent, a neighbor, I'm not talking about a super influential person. I'm talking about somebody that lives right down the street. You know, when they say that this is an economic reality, I have to at least listen. I think it's my job as a legislator to listen to all viewpoints. I don't have to necessarily support what they're saying, and guess what? I don't. And so so I think it's important to recognize that when we can have a civil conversation about these issues and not undercut voters at all. You know, and so I think having the conversation, letting facts lead the way. Facts are hard to come by in politics because guess what? Everybody puts their spin on just about everything. Democrats do it, Republicans do it. And it frankly is tiring because you can't operate government through a 30-second soundbite. You have to get into the weeds, right? And actually get down to brass tacks. So that bill's not going to go anywhere. There was a slew of bills that I'm pushing back on. You know, question 2 is under attack on my committee. I serve on the taxation committee, and every single day I'm told by lobbyists that voters didn't understand the referendums. If people just read the referendums, they were clear. People understood what they were voting for, and they came out in droves, record numbers, to say this is a priority. So when lobbyists are attacking question 2 and are trying to overturn that, like the Chamber of Commerce, I'm on the front line saying, I'm drawing a line. I will not vote for a budget if it doesn't include 55% for education funding. That's critically important. That impacts those students that you were talking about. That impacts the next generation of workers in the state of Maine. So it's not as black and white as one bill or what you sponsored or what you didn't co-sponsor. It's about your actions at the end of the day, what you're voting on, and what you're doing every day to push back on bad policies.
Yeah, very fair. Do you? I just want to kind of just close with a couple more questions.
Yep.
We're about at the end here. We made it. We made it through educating our viewers. So I kind of wanted to kind of get your personal perspective on this in terms of, because you were talking about, you know, larger lobbying groups like the NRA or something like outright bullying, or in a way like almost threatening with you know, attack ads and that sort of thing. But have you ever encountered, I guess, in your career thus far, I guess a less blatant, obviously most encounters with lobbyists are like less blatant, but like something that you found very convincing and yet you feel a little slimy about it, you know what I mean? Like someone who's sat you down, who's convinced you of something, and yet you know that they are represented by interests that you don't necessarily stand for, but you've been... That's
a fair question. You know, I work hand in hand oftentimes with the Maine Education Association, who represents teachers, great teachers all across our state. I take any lobbyist for what it is with a grain of salt, because I want to make sure that I'm listening to facts more than anything else. But when you have a collection of teachers, for instance, in my district that I listen to me, that's a big difference than a corporation that is in it for the bottom line. Fighting for the next generation to have a quality education isn't necessarily, a bad thing. Though I will say the amount of money and influence from any special interest group in corporate interest or lobbyist is vitally important to disband and limit. So whether we're talking about a union, whether we're talking about a teachers association, or whether we're talking about the NRA, we're talking about the Walmarts of the world, the AstraZenecas.
They want to enrich themselves, so if you're sometimes in line with them because you might agree with them.
I don't disagree. I lump all lobbyists in the same category because I don't want any sort of perception of corruption to cloud the important work that we do every single day. I want to make sure that we're just focused on policy and there's no sort of lingering questions of where people are at. We're fighting on behalf of the people that put us in these seats. We're fighting on the people, on behalf of the state of Maine. That's what I want it to be about. And, when public service and running for office is constantly under attack nowadays, I want to, again, restore a sense of trust and credibility in the institution of government. And the only way to do that is limit the amount of money in the system, also limit the amount of money from lobbyists giving to legislators, and the revolving door of lawmakers becoming lobbyists. Then and only then can we have a system where people trust that, hey, they have our back. They're fighting for our best interests. So again, yes, there might be things I agree with the MEA on. There might be things I agree with one group or the other. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm taking any of their money or that I'm listening, intently to what they're saying. It's really about recognizing that we're changing and reforming the entire system to be cleaner and more ethical. In fact, I have legislation to make it the most ethical in the entire country. That is what we need to pass. That is what we need to do in order to start tackling the real problems that we face.
And what do you feel is your greatest opposition in this? What, in terms of getting these done? Because you're introducing some of these ideas. Is it coming from your own colleagues? Is it coming from the fact that nobody really cares in the sense that it's not hedgehogs? No one,
That's the fun topic of the day, right? Or carrots,
Is it, or is there just like a lack of drive to accomplish it? Or is it the kind of like Paul LePage's position of like when I think he vetoed. Now I'm spacing out on it, of course, but it basically more just about, like kind of you were saying, that the perception that everything is above board often kind of masks things, just not like it's more of a like a Band-Aid on the issue, I guess. I guess what do you find to be the greatest obstacles to creating more ethical government in Maine as a final thought?
What's frustrating is when Democrats are in power, they don't want to strengthen ethics or deal with the money and politics problem. When Republicans are in power, they don't want to tackle the money and politics problem or make it more ethical because, again, it's about keeping your position of power, regardless of political affiliation. But I am extremely disappointed in my own Democratic colleagues where it's in the Democratic Party platform to fight to get money out of politics, limit the amount of influence from lobbyists.
When they often spend more money than Republicans in the state of Maine. It's kind of well known.
Or more specifically, they vote against bills like mine that seek to make it more ethical and limit that influence. And so it's really hard for me to see that hypocritical stance when it's in our platform and yet they're not advocating when they actually get into positions of power to affect the kind of change that they said on the campaign trail that they wanted. So I find oftentimes I'm fighting with my own party on the issue of getting lobbyists out of the equation or making something more ethical. But you know what? Republicans vote against my bills too. So it's one of those things where it's going to take a bipartisan outcry from the public. And I think that's why we're able to get some reforms in last session. And that's why we're going to continue to push. Whether we don't pass one of my bills this session, I'm going to continue to push and push and push. And things like this, these conversations are critical because I hope the public gets involved, emails their legislator to say, this is not acceptable anymore. The status quo is not going to be tolerated next election cycle. We are going to look for candidates and campaigns that are advocating for a more ethical government and that are going to strengthen the ethics of our state and that are going to get money out of politics. And we're going to, basically follow our votes with our passions. And that's what I really hope that the public does.
Yeah, democratic solutions. Great. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
That's
Ali.
it. That's a wrap. And
I love all of these goodies.
Yeah,
this is great.
Eat these. And thank you very much.
Thanks.